Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear esteemed speakers, panelists, workshop moderators, dear friends and participants. It is my privilege to welcome you as the chair of the Roundtable Human Rights in Tourism to our 5th annual symposium. My name is Antje Monshausen. I'm head of Tourism Watch at Bread for the World, one of the civil society organization members in the Roundtable, and I'm serving as the chair of this multi-stakeholder initiative. After 1.5 years of crisis mode, the international tourism community is far away from returning to business as usual. And multiple crises, the most frightening being the climate catastrophe, made us aware that there's no simple return to the old normal. What we need more than ever is a guiding star to move us forward through these uncertain times. Uncertainties and crises are the raison d'etre of the United Nations since its foundation. Over the decade, they tried to develop a framework that is addressing the human rights responsibility of companies. It was Professor John Ruggie who finally developed the Protect, Respect, Remedy framework. His empathy for the different stakeholders and his brilliant mind, which combined profound knowledge but also a vision for human rights architecture that addresses the responsibility of businesses, was the precondition for his success 10 years ago. In 2011, the United Nations Human Rights Council adopted the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. It is with great sadness that we learned of the passing of Professor Ruggie last week. He will be greatly missed, but his legacy is that he provided us with a functioning compass. It does not only give us orientation in the human rights field, but also guiding us through this current challenging times. Human rights, sustainable development, and business success are not contrasting poles, but absolutely interlinked with one another. In this spirit, we decided to choose the title From Obligation to Aspiration for our symposium. We will learn about new legislative development in an increasing number of countries which recently adopted supply chain laws, but we will also learn about the business case of putting people first. Before I'm handing over to our moderator of the day, the fabulous Julie Schindall, I invite you to see how the Roundtable is working and what we offer for our members. We would be very happy to welcome some new members after this symposium. But first of all, I wish all of you and all of us a very interesting and inspiring day. Thank you.
Working in tourism, you know, it's a people's business that depends first and foremost on the people who work in the industry and who live in tourism destinations. The business case for respecting human rights in tourism is obvious. Motivated staff and suppliers and respect for the local population are key to high quality and sustainable tourism products. Guest satisfaction is directly correlated with the well-being of the hosts. Exploitative working conditions, discrimination, and competition for scarce local resources such as water or land threaten local people and communities, and the long-term business success of tour operators as well. Every tourism activity has an impact. Companies must take responsibility to strengthen positive impacts and avoid negative ones. You need a strategy to actively respect human rights along the value chain. The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights serve as a global guideline for this process. Human rights are not an add-on. They are at the core of every corporate strategy and all activities. You may be wondering what you and your company can do. There are some measures that you as a tourism company can implement yourself. For example, engaging in a dialogue with your local suppliers and partners is a first step to assess your risks and act responsibly. Other measures require collaboration within the industry. In a joint effort, tourism companies can increase their influence and establish standards for decent working conditions for hotel staff, tour guides, and drivers in destinations. The Roundtable Human Rights in Tourism will support you. Join our international multi-stakeholder initiative and profit from a trusted platform for exchange and mutual learning to identify positive impact opportunities along the entire value chain. We are developing online tools and guidelines, provide resources and expertise, and coordinate demand-oriented pilot projects. We join forces for human rights in tourism. Become a member, because without human rights, there is no sustainable tourism development.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm Julie Schindall, and I'm your moderator today. It's a pleasure to see some of you here in this space, and thanks to Antje for her terrific intro for us. I want to dive in and talk straight away about what we're going to talk about today, the perspectives and expertise we're going to hear about, and the really practical hands-on experience that you'll get a chance to get into dialogue and exchange about. So first up this morning, we're going to have in-depth insights and real expertise about what expectations are of companies when it comes to knowing and showing that they do business with respect for human rights, that they do human rights due diligence. And that's going to be a conversation with Lise Smit from the British Institute for International and Comparative Law. We'll be talking about what does good look like also when it comes to mandating human rights due diligence, which is a trend we're certainly seeing from a number of jurisdictions. Then we're going to pull back the lens and talk about why all of this business in human rights things, why this human rights due diligence thing, and is there a business case? Is it actually helpful for companies to do business in a rights respecting way? What's the value? And Doug Lansky is going to be with us to talk about that. Just before 11 o'clock here in Germany, I promise we will have a short break. And then we're going to come back and we're really going to talk about practice. We have 3 practitioners of human rights due diligence with us, colleagues from the tourism sector at different levels of the tourism value chain, who are going to talk to us about their practical experiences implementing human rights due diligence measures, challenges they've faced, learning they've had, etc. Now let's talk a little bit about housekeeping and make sure that we touch all those points. First of all, I want to be clear that this event is recorded. I believe you are all aware of that. You should have seen that notification when you entered the Zoom meeting, but to reiterate, this event is recorded. Secondly, we really welcome your participation. Again, missing the opportunity to be together with you in person, but we can achieve some level of interaction, and that is through the Zoom chat. So whenever you have questions or remarks, just enter those into the Zoom chat, and the team from the Roundtable is moderating the chat. We'll bring up your questions and remarks to me on my moderator's screen here, and I can pull that into our conversation and pose your questions to our speakers throughout our day. So please don't hesitate. You can do that, and please do that. Finally, if at any point in time you want to be sure where we are in the agenda, you're curious about what is coming up, the URL with the agenda for the event is in the Zoom chat. I see that Katarina has just posted that. So if at any time you're lost, you're wondering where are we, check the Zoom chat, the URL is in there. So finally, I just want to remind ourselves, we are, for those of you, depending on your time zone, in our afternoon here in Germany after our lunch break, we're going to be having a number of opportunities to really get into dialogue through breakout rooms, 5 different rooms where colleagues from the tourism sector will be talking about projects they've undertaken, challenges they've addressed, and that's a real chance to get into dialogue and learning with your peers from the sector. So really hoping that we'll see you in those opportunities, and then we'll be wrapping up at about 1:45 p.m. Germany time. So that's an overview of the day, and I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you via your questions and as you speak up in your breakout rooms and those opportunities. So without talking more at you, I want to immediately move over to our first guest of today. We have Lise Smit, who is a senior research fellow in business and human rights at the British Institute of International and Comparative Law. Lise is a leading researcher on human rights due diligence practices and other aspects of the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Prior to her work at the British Institute, Lise was a practicing advocate at the Cape Town Bar in South Africa. And she was a law clerk as well at the South African Constitutional Court. She worked on business and human rights issues specifically prior to her work at the British Institute, as well at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center and at the UN Global Compact. Lise, I am so glad you can join us this morning. I know you're going to pop in soon here on our screens, and we're going to see you very soon with us, your smiling face this morning. Because we're going to be having a conversation about, hello, Lise, about what we can expect, what does good look like when it comes to human rights due diligence, what's really the expectation of companies, and what do companies need to know when it comes to these evolving mandatory measures. So if you want to just unmute your mic, Lise, and say good morning, then we're sure we've got you on audio there.
Good morning, Julie. Thank you so much for the introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lise. Great. So, I want to start with the big developments, the newsy angle here, because I think many people with us today are aware there have in the arc of the last 10 years, since the guiding principles were unanimously endorsed at the UN Human Rights Council, we've kind of gone from first figuring out, well, what does human rights due diligence even mean, through to, okay, what would leading practice look like? What would pitfalls be that we should try to avoid? And now the big talk is, whoa, this is turning mandatory from not one, but multiple jurisdictions, whether at the European Union level or at the national level. So talk us through initially these big developments in the last couple of years that we really particularly need to be aware of, and share with us your sense of, are these positive developments? What's the value add of these latest developments?
Thank you so much, Julie. That's a really important question. So as you say, the UNGPs have been massively influential in the past decade since they've been adopted. And we also noted with sadness this morning the passing of Professor John Ruggie, the main author of the UN Guiding Principles, whose work we wouldn't be having this conversation today. As the UNGPs says in the title, they are, of course, guiding principles, and they're not binding law. And since their adoption, there have been various laws that have borrowed from them or been influenced by their concepts, such as import bans and reporting requirements. And these laws often focus on specific issues such as modern slavery, child labor, forced labor, etc. But the UNGPs, as we know, expressly apply to all human rights and to all sectors. And in recent years, we've really seen a new wave of legislation that directly aims to turn the UNGPs into hard law. The first example that should be mentioned is the French Duty of Vigilance Law of 2017, which applies to certain large companies across all sectors, imposes a duty of vigilance regarding all human rights and severe environmental harms. The second recent example, as we know, is the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Law, which was adopted this year. It's also cross-sectoral, also refers to the human rights due diligence concept that we see originally in the UNGPs. And then a third prominent example is at EU level. BICCL, my organization, actually led a study for the European Commission, which has formed the basis for a legislative initiative which is currently underway to impose mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence, again, cross-sectorally and including all human rights. There's some other ongoing legislative examples underway across Europe and elsewhere. So we are really seeing now a new wave of laws. And what distinguishes these laws is that they literally use the same language and concepts as the UNGPs. And as we're saying, they're cross-sectoral, they apply to all human rights and sometimes environmental harms, which is, so not just certain issues, and they refer to this concept of the due diligence or the duty of vigilance, which we see from the UNGPs. We have, identified a range of benefits there in our studies for business, the level playing field, the legal certainty, the harmonization of the standards, the facilitation of leverage through the value chain. But first and foremost, also this effect of harmonizing the different requirements that you're required to comply with in accordance with what we know from the UNGPs. So that in effect, you only, ideally, if they're designed right, you just have to comply with that one original standard, if you will. So I have to also put in the caveat here, as these laws are still very new, we still have to see how they are designed, implemented and applied, and they all have slightly different models of enforcement. But this is exactly why this is such an important time to start thinking about these questions and how to align corporate practice with what is coming in the legislation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lise, for that overview. And I think certainly for companies trying to get a handle on what is the legal expectation of us going to be, this is still a very evolving space. But I think that perhaps from a company perspective, what is helpful in this instance is that the UN guiding principles themselves, we've had those for 10 years. We certainly know what's in there. We know what leading practice looks like. There's quite a lot of guidance and examples out there about how do you cope with dilemmas and that kind of issue. So as long as these forthcoming mandatory measures hew closely to the vision set out in the guiding principles, in a way, companies know what would be coming. It's not like, surprise, we've never seen this before. So what I want to though ask in relation to that is, of course, so far we've talked about like, okay, what are the process steps? Because human rights due diligence is a process as a system. It's a management system, which is actually not new to the UN guiding principles. The concept of due diligence certainly far precedes the UN guiding principles. So we can maybe say, sure, we can understand what the process should look like and what that expectation is, but what about the results? And I think for, in a lot of my conversations over the years with companies, that's the big concern, and especially as the concept of human rights due diligence becomes perhaps mandatory or is mandatory to certain degrees. The question is, okay, so what do I actually need to deliver then? What does good look like? Is it enough that I put a system in place? Or do I have to fix human rights? For a global company, for a tourism sector company that is maybe knowingly operating in challenging contexts, but trying to do it in a responsible way, what are they expected to deliver to reach the bar, the standard?
That's a really good question that we think about now all the time as these laws are being designed and compliance is thought through. I would say in order to answer it is important, like you say, to go back to that original concept in the UNGPs, which has those two components, both the focus on the harms and the actual potential impacts. So it's not a process in the abstract, but also not just fixing them, but how do you address them? How do you identify them? So to look at how human rights due diligence is described as in the UNGPs as part of the corporate responsibility to respect human rights, it's defined as the process by which the company can identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for its actual or potential adverse human rights impact. So it has those four ongoing components, which is the identification and assessing of the adverse impacts, taking actions to address the impacts, monitoring and tracking the effectiveness of the actions, and then communicating on how the impacts are addressed. It applies, as we know, not just to the company's own activities, but to third parties in the value chain, the cause, contributory, and directly linked, the concept of leverage, exercising leverage and increasing leverage. And all these aspects, when we know the UNGP's concept, refers to that ongoing engagement. Rather, it's not an absolute standard of 1 or 0, fix everything or leave. It's an ongoing standard that does relate to the risks. It's not an abstract tick box process that you can do without reference to your context. So it has both those components, and they are both very important as we start thinking about compliance with legal requirements. The idea that also, the UNGPs are clear that terminating or exiting environment is not the answer either. And if you do that, you have to do human rights risk assessment for that as well. So it's not an idea to try and get people out of risky environments, but instead a process of deeper engagement and improvement over time, which we know is so important to human rights, especially in some other more high risk, developing parts of the world. So the standard that we know from the UNGPs recognizes that some human rights are more severe than others. You have to prioritize. There's a real risk assessment process here based on severity to the people, the human rights holders, rather than the risks to the company. And so basically this idea that the company is expected to exercise care not to harm people or the planet, which, as you mentioned, is something that's not new. It's a standard that we know from before. And the focus is not just on fixing the actual harms, but what is or whether the harms are occurring or not. But that's the first part of the inquiry. But then the question is, what is the company doing about identifying and preventing and mitigating those harms? Now, obviously, the question is whether the legislation will be designed to reflect this, and whether judges and administrative bodies will implement it in this way. And that's a big if. But we know that with well-designed legislation, there has to be a way of meeting the required legal standard. So we know that there are human rights risks everywhere in the world, and sometimes they are systemic and they're not possible for one company alone, or even a sector to fix by itself. And the idea is not to require individual companies to fix these problems or leave, as we said, but instead to require companies, the basic general duty to identify, prevent, and improve, and to be able to demonstrate how they are doing this. And hopefully that would be how the legal standard is designed.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that. So it sounds like at the end of the day, you're communicating through your expertise of what's in the guiding principles themselves as, let's say, the guiding document for legislation, that companies do not necessarily need to worry that they need to alone solve systemic human rights abuses in a given country where they have operations, but they do need to demonstrate they are taking really robust measures that perhaps build over time to prevent and address any harms. And in terms of the legislative aspect, it remains to be seen a little bit what it might look like in terms of what is the standard expected of companies in terms of actual outcomes for people. So maybe that's still a developing story on that front. So thanks for illustrating those two pieces of understanding that any company and any other stakeholder would need to have. So you mentioned in your answer to that one, the issue of sectors, right? There's the aspect of companies alone, what companies need to do to understand their human rights risks and take action to prevent or address them. And then we also know that sectors have risks that are sort of common to their sector, so they can do some joint learning there and win some efficiencies there. But of course, if they're going to address some of their major human rights risks, it's probably not going to be just a single company in the sector. Probably many companies in the sector share that risk because they are connected via the value chain. And of course, the Roundtable Human Rights in Tourism is a value chain initiative that includes companies from different parts of the value chain. So given that this is a symposium today for the tourism sector, you've done quite a lot of research around what would reasonable legislation look like when it comes to mandating expectations of perhaps specific sectors as compared to all companies. We know the guiding principles are looking at all companies. What's your take on that sector specific versus all companies approach in terms of what good legislation might present?
Thank you so much. That's also a really big question, obviously, at the moment. So one of the helpful things about how human rights due diligence is defined in the UNGPs is that it is not prescriptive and it's not a tick box exercise. It places the responsibility on the entity or the company itself to decide what its risks are and how to address them. And then the way that this is done, obviously, this is a legal standard, that can be tested. So, the choices the company makes, what to prioritize, how thorough its due diligence process is. These are the kind of things that ideally should be tested through the law. So that the quality of the due diligence could be objectively evaluated in terms of the law without stipulating in the legislation what it is that exactly that you need to do. And that gives companies those flexibility, which they are required to take in terms of the identification and assessment of the severe risks that applies in their context. So this means that the human rights due diligence standard lends itself very well to the daily activities of business, because no two businesses are the same, even within the same sector. We have seen time and time again, even within the same sector, companies often have broadly different human rights risks because they operate in different parts of the world, very different business models and different services or products. So it is a bit of a fallacy that has been continuing, this idea that certain sectors only have to worry about specific certain rights. For example, in the tourism sector, as we all know, one could think of everything from modern slavery, enforced labor and trafficking, to freedom of movement and data privacy, health, carbon emissions, equality and anti-discrimination, conflicting requirements in just domestic jurisdictions, which is also something that the UNGPs deal with, relationships with challenging governments. And so there's no one-size-fits-all approach, and that's exactly what due diligence is about, is what are my risks, what do I have to worry about, and what do I not have to worry about? And so for this reason, our research has shown that companies actually prefer a more general duty because it gives them that flexibility to focus on their real-life issues and addressing those thoroughly, rather than those risks that are traditionally associated with their sector, but which might not apply to them. In the study that we led for the European Commission, for example, we surveyed over 650 respondents, over half of which were from within companies. And the majority of business respondents preferred cross-sectoral regulation that obviously takes into account the specificities and the context and the industry guidance, but does not prescribe specific risks or checklists to companies based on their sector. And the interviewees explained why, including that, for example, one interview was from the mining sector, but said they still have a supply chain that includes tech and equipment, boots and uniforms, coffee and catering services. So by sort of, compartmentalizing certain sectors, it doesn't really help them. So because it then would force them to focus on one part of those sectors in their value chain while excluding others, and that they find superficial but also counterproductive in terms of resource allocation. And this idea then also ties in with what we mentioned about the benefits, which the majority of respondents see from a general duty, which is that, the level playing field across all sectors, the legal certainty of what is required, again, across all my operations, not just in some parts of, where I work, the harmonization effect, and then the facilitation of leverage with suppliers and business partners. And that's obviously incredibly important in the tourism sector, where so much, depends on the context of the destination. And it's not really that helpful if the law only applies to some of those relationships and not to the others. You really lose that negotiating power. And the last aspect that respondents mentioned, which I think is extremely important in the tourism sector, is the collective power that a law, especially at European level, have across sectors. For example, one respondent was operating in the food and in agriculture supply value chain in Indonesia, and they were saying that as an individual part of the market, they don't have a big part of the market in Indonesia, but when they go collectively as the food industry, and now if there's a European law, that will, that's an even bigger group. And potentially now, if we have a European law, we have cross-sectoral pressure put on, the local context and the local suppliers and the government, etc., to help with that collective improvement of practices. So that's kind of one of the things that respondents are feeding back to us about why this would really help individual companies that are operating in high-risk sectors and are unaware of that. And that's also why we see the new wave of laws that we've seen are cross-sectoral, precisely because of this reason, the logic of allowing business to properly address their most severe risk, without earmarking or delineating at a regulatory level what should and should not be prioritized, and then allowing companies to identify and know their actual potential risks, like many companies already do, and then to make demonstrable efforts to prevent and address those impacts to the best of their abilities.
Thank you, Lise, for going over that, because it is a little bit of a complex issue, but I appreciate you sort of drawing all those threads together for us. And what I think I heard you also illustrating for us is that when it comes to understanding the human rights risks that you have as an individual company, that's something that you're going to have to do individually, no matter what. You could certainly get ideas and guidance from, for example, sector-specific initiatives like the Roundtable. And then when it comes, though, to taking action to prevent and address those risks, because it's a total value chain approach, you're going to need to work with others. That's a given. And that is then sometimes, especially a sectoral initiative, can be particularly helpful for that, because most companies alone will not have the leverage, the influence to do that with their value chain partners, and they probably don't have the resources either. So thanks for illustrating sort of those two key steps in the process. We have just a couple of minutes remaining, and I want to remind everybody in the audience, you can ask questions. I know it feels so strange in this virtual setting, and we don't have one of those old-fashioned lines to the microphone where you get to raise your hand and ask Lisa a question, but you can ask them, you can pose them in the chat, and I do get them here at my moderator's table. So don't hesitate if you have questions to ask. In the couple of minutes remaining, though, while we wait and see if a question comes in here, Lisa, I did have one question that I think is perhaps kind of a burning question for a number of our guests today, which is this issue of what is a company supposed to do when they are operating in a high-risk context, and again, perhaps actually expressly operating there because they think they can make a positive contribution. It's not like all business activities are always negative. So talk to us about how companies need to understand their responsibility under the UN guiding principles, under mandatory measures, when they are in high-risk contexts, but also see that maybe withdrawing isn't the answer either.
This is a really important question right now. I mean, it is a lot of concern about, the European law acting as a sort of protectionist mechanism and for divestment to take place in, the countries that need it most. And, I'm from South Africa. And so we've just had a call the other day with the African coalition on these laws. There is a real fear that these laws are going to, companies are going to pack up and leave, and for human rights, that's a disaster. But again, the real answer to that is that look at the UNGPs, look at what human rights intelligence says. It actually expressly says termination of the agreement is a last resort, and should only be done if you're very sure that no form of engagement or leverage or capacity building or due diligence is going to help you at all. And what we also have to mention there is, and if you withdraw, you should do a human rights impact assessment about what the withdrawal will mean for the local community. We've seen some companies do those. Tourism is very similar. I mean, mining is the same. You have to go where the destinations are. You have to go where the resources are. You cannot choose to relocate your value chain, if you will, to a more convenient, less risky situation. But I mean, that, like we say, is a good thing. I mean, the idea would be for this to help give companies that legal leverage to improve. And like we said, hopefully, if the laws are designed right, you are not going to be held responsible for the bad things that are happening in the country where you are working, but for how you engage with that. And again, we cannot look at this as let's say this country is a high-risk country, we should pull out of that, because there are some companies that are operating there in a responsible way, and then there are companies that operate in a non-responsible, and we see that everywhere. I mean, even in Europe, there are companies that operate with good labor practices and bad labor practices. So I think there's a tendency to look at this with a bit of a knee-jerk reaction, but the real requirement that we should look at is, we know there are risks. We know there are risks everywhere. And that is already the first part of our due diligence, is knowing our risks. So that's a good thing. So we need to continue. What are we going to do about it, etc. The opposite of that is not knowing what the risks are or denying that there are risks. And that is not due diligence. So I don't know if that is helpful. And again, I don't speak for the laws. I can't really provide legal advice yet on how the laws will be implemented, but hopefully they will be consistent with this understanding that we have from the UNGPs.
Thank you so much, Lise. We are at the conclusion of our session for your insightful remarks. And I just want to say a final note here. To me, what I'm taking away from this conversation is really, again, maybe we can tamp down some of the fear of these forthcoming mandatory measures because we know what should be in them because it's already in the UN guiding principles. There's a lot of practice and guidance out there on that. And through mandatory measures, we can achieve a lot of positives like a level playing field, legal certainty, going, oh, okay, finally, everything is harmonized, the expectations are clear, and really increases our ability to work with our value chain partners to achieve a reduction in harms to the people and communities affected by our work. So Lise, I want to say a huge thank you for sharing your expertise this morning, really valuable stuff. So I'm going to say thank you and farewell to Lise. And I'm going to transition straight away here to Doug, because Doug is going to do for us. We've gotten deep into detail with Lise. What are the expectations? What is human rights due diligence? And Doug's going to say, hold up, what's the big picture? Why are we doing this? What is the value of this whole thing? Business, doing business with respect for human rights, etc. So Doug, we're so pleased to have you with us this morning. Share with us that big picture vision of the value of a rights respecting business.
Hi, and good morning to everyone. And I just want to say it's so nice to see such a diverse group of people. And let me just jump right into this thing and do the screen share and start this thing off. Here we go. So basically, when you guys came to me and started asking me about this is what was so embarrassing, is that I've spoken at probably 200-300 tourism conferences around the world. This hasn't come up. It's crazy. And I was trying to really like boil it down. I thought I had a good grip of what it was. So I'm kind of taking you through my little journey here. I was like, oh, right. So that's prostitution in tourism. And you're like, well, I was like, is it human trafficking? We were playing this guessing game when we first started talking about this conference. Is it child prostitution? Is it over tourism that it affects it? Is it in all its forms that people can't get out of their cars because there's no place to park when they've come someplace? Is it, walking on the coral and ruining the oceans, or clear cutting the forest to make golf courses and spewing hotel gook into the oceans and polluting our seas? Is it these water issues where people go on holiday to these countries where they're using 20 times the water that the locals are using and it's running dry? I mean, that's got to be it, right? And I was like, we were playing this guessing game. How about in Cuba when the cruise ship showed up and all these hotels were just recently built as Cuba opened up, and they're having power issues. They're having blackouts every single day, everywhere. So I thought, isn't that it? And it was like, well, yeah, it's those things and beyond. And so it was such a puzzle for me to kind of try to put this together. And as we saw in that video when we started, it's also the exploitation of the people. It's how those things affect the people. And this was like eye-opening for me. I hadn't really thought about it. I thought if they didn't want to do it, they wouldn't do it, but it's not that simple, right? Tourism loves to mention job creation. We talk about it all the time at conferences. Here's what we don't talk about. What if that job's paying people to whatever, spray poison on plants, or, working in the hotels for 18 hours a day and paying them just almost nothing. And that's the only thing they can get. We don't talk about that. And so this needs to be front and center. I didn't realize how vital this was and how much we've been neglecting it. It's like a lot to consider when I thought, because, I felt like this when they were first telling me about this. It's kind of like, oh, I want to get organic coffee. Oh, I can find that. And then you go to someone says, no, you need fair trade coffee. And you're like, wait a second. I want organic and fair trade, which, and then you see two different products and they each have one mark on them and you have to pick. And you like look around the store and then you go, oh, finally, there's an organic place that's also fair trade. And it's kind of a relief, because at first you felt like you're making this choice. And then someone says, oh yeah, and you also have to make sure it's CO2 compensated. Like, oh God, not that too. Is that more I've got to think about? And then you see, oh, you look around a little bit more and you find that there is actually a product that's doing this. There it is. And that's where it gets really interesting. I think you can find something like that. And the tourism human rights version of that is also on the shelf, right? There it is. You have the guiding principles. It tells you all of those things that you need to think about right there, right off the shelf. And it's so important. I didn't realize it. And the thing is, I was actually thinking about stakeholder in the wrong way. When in tourism, I'm going to these conferences, I think of stakeholders kind of like this, like people who own the hotels and the museums. That's what comes to my mind. I guess that could also be a stakeholder, and technically speaking, that's also a stakeholder. But this was a stakeholder that I needed to rethink about. This is what I'd been overlooking myself. These people have a stake in the business, and they are the ones who are often getting abused from this stuff, working crazy hours for little pay. And I hadn't personally been thinking of them that way. And the thing is, it's how it affects the locals' quality of life negatively, and what we can do. And this is the reason why it's happening in the tourism industry. Here's like the world's most simple Venn diagram, right? You got the tourism industry and visitors experience, and that's how the industry views it. Those are the only two things. It needs, and if you do it like that, this is what's happening. It's essentially tourist farming, right? It's an industry in which we've not paid attention to the other aspects. And by other aspects, I mean this. It needs to find that sweet spot where it factors in local life quality and environment, and make sure that we're nailing it right in the center. This is the model that tourism needs to take in the future, because we see that residents are speaking out. They're jumping into the Grand Canal in Venice in front of cruise ships. They're taking action to say that this is important for them. And the thing is, why is that? Why are these responsible regulations? Why are they good for business? And here's a really simple analogy. I think we all know how to park a car, right? Pretty basic stuff. So why do they put all these white lines for us everywhere? Like as if we don't know how to park. Well, when they don't have those white lines there, it can look like this easily. And like nobody can get it right if you don't have those white lines. Parking just get messed up in a hurry. No one actually makes the shopping malls paint those lines. They self-regulate, right? To be smart. It's an investment to do that. It gets more people in and it keeps the experience higher. Self-regulation in a smart way is actually good for business. So when you take tourism without those kind of white parking lines, what happens? Well, we see over and over, forced labor, the headlines speak for themselves. Things like this, trampling on human rights in Indonesia. And it's not just the global south where it's happening. It's happening right under our noses in Europe, right? Modern slavery in UK hotels. In Iceland, there's like a black market flourishing from the tourism boom. We see this as the front line of human trafficking. These are those low-level jobs where that happens. Everywhere we look, we start to see this is happening again and again. And my first question is, I was looking at all these headlines and just with my jaw dropping, I'm like, how does this happen? How do these like brand name hotels get away with it? Well, for a lot of them, they hire a third party to do that work for them. And that way they can separate themselves. If for those who aren't doing due diligence, you don't notice. So tourism is selling something that doesn't belong to them. They're selling the culture and these places and if you have something that doesn't belong to you, shouldn't we treat it with a little bit more care and not abuse it? There's this historical lesson for smart business here, right? There's a couple. I was looking, first thing that came to mind was the automotive industry. They're very reluctant to do the right thing for a long time. And we could say, since they came into action, we're looking at the gas mileage, that it's actually gotten so much higher. This is the gas miles per gallon. It's gotten so much better over the years, but they didn't want this. The automotive industry was kicking and screaming as they started doing this, right? In 1970, the US Congress passed their first Clean Air Act. They said they had to do it. Nixon signed it. The EPA said they had to start testing the cars. Then they created kind of transportation controls. Then in 1975, there was the Energy Policy Conservation Act. They had the first catalytic converters. And the Michigan auto industry was resisting, spending millions to combat these regulations, right? But today, because of those regulations, SUVs and pickup trucks and things like, they're 99% cleaner from the main pollutants than they were in 1970, thanks to the regulations. And here's the thing, this is the blood levels in humans. This is how much lead goes into our bodies. And we can see that going down. That's a great number. People see that and they like it. So they're actually, as Trump was trying to release some of the, or loosen some of the restrictions on this Clean Air Act, people started speaking up saying, No. We like it. We consumers like it. And the auto industry is selling more vehicles, which is what their aim was all along, by having lower emissions. So it actually helped them in the long run. Same with the pharmaceutical industry. They had all these snake oil salesmen selling all sorts of junk that wasn't tested, right? You think these guys wanted testing? Then in 1938, this elixir that on the right that you're looking at there, that's what did it. It killed about 100 kids. And that's when they decided to put the Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act into place. And they wanted evidence that the product was safe before they could sell it. And then once that was in action, this woman working at the FDA actually tested it and blocked this medicine that would have killed tons of people if it had been allowed without testing. So they're starting to see that it worked. And the drug makers, of course, were resisting this. Like, they don't want to have to go through extra tests and go jump through a bunch of administrative hoops as they see it. But all those things created consumer confidence. In fact, there was a declaration of Helsinki where there was a global awakening to this consumer confidence that they all signed on, and they wanted medicine tested. And a big part of this has been restoring, and they still have to do it, is restore, as we see today with Corona, restoring confidence in the pharmaceutical industry. And because they've done it so well, it's now a gazillion, I don't even know, it's a quadrillion dollar industry globally because it has consumer confidence. If they hadn't done this stuff, right? The regulations help the companies get on the right side of history, as they've done all along. And they push against them. They push against them. But being on the right side of history, as we show again and again, it's actually good for business. They don't realize it right then. They think it's like a pain in the butt at that moment, but it's actually pushing them in the right direction. And it'd be great if every destination just adopted these regulations and did due diligence everywhere, but they're not doing it yet. And because they're not doing it yet, it's up to the companies, it's up to all of us to do our due diligence and make sure that this stuff happens. And to help with that, we see that there's these great tools you can now find online to help figure out, because it's not always so easy. So there's nice that there's tools out there that can help us find the right path. And I just want to end with this. Remember the first traffic light in the world? This is one of the very first. How hard of a sell would that have been? Going into City Hall and saying, okay, I've got this idea. I'm going to put a light there with some colors on it, stick it in the middle of the street, and we're going to stop traffic and regulate it and make it go faster by stopping it. They'd have probably thrown you out. But having these self-imposed regulations that seem to slow things at the beginning actually speed things up and are good for everybody. Thank you guys so much. I'm glad to, it's an honor to have some of your time today. And this is such an important topic. Thank you. And back to you.
Doug, thank you so much for going through that. Really brilliant to take a moment. You know, we dove in really deep right away in the morning, and then you brought us through this really interesting kind of historical arc in a way, both your own experience, because I do appreciate, and I have certainly observed every person who opens their eyes to the concept of doing business with respect for human rights, that responsibility is there and that it is feasible. That's a personal journey and then of evolution. And then you illustrated wonderfully the arc of history and all of these cases we can turn to and go, oh yeah, actually regulating something when it has to do with business activity and its impact on human beings has worked. It's been really positive, and it's not something to be afraid of. It's not something that's new. That's certainly not new. And it's things that today with the arc of history, we actually take for granted. We're like, of course, medicines are tested today. Of course, cars can't be pumping out a ton of smog into the air. And these kind of understanding of what is, of course, acceptable expectations of business practices, this evolves. I personally take great comfort from that in a way, to know that we're part of the arc of history. And I really appreciate you illustrating that in terms of the concept of business doing business with respect for human rights is also part of this evolving understanding of, yeah, that's just how business gets done. And so I appreciate you putting that together for us. We're coming up here. Your timing is brilliant, Doug. It's as if you're a radio man. That's my background. So you got that timing right on. So thanks a lot, Doug, for being with us. Brilliant author, speaker, and tourism expert. So thank you, Doug, for being with us today.
Pleasure.
And I want to say again, big thanks to Doug and Lise for kicking us off in our first block of today's symposium. And now we come to that exciting time when I get to say there is a break. So it is a very short break. It's a 5-minute break, but it is a chance for you to get up, stretch your legs, get a cup of tea or a coffee, maybe call somebody back quickly if you've got to do that. And when we come back in 5 minutes, which is at 10:55 a.m. here in Germany, in Central Europe, we're going to talk about practice. We've spent our morning talking a bit about big concepts. Now let's get down to the doing. And we have 3 wonderful colleagues from the tourism sector to talk to us about that. I'm looking forward to that conversation. I will see you back here in 5 minutes. Hello and welcome back, everybody. We are back in our virtual space together, and I'm really looking forward to the next part of our conversation. I hope you had a chance to stretch your legs, to get a cup of coffee before we continue and really get down to business, talking about doing the doing. You know, we've been talking about concepts and expectations when it comes to companies knowing and showing that they respect human rights in their own operations and value chains. We talked about why any of this matters, the long arc of history when it comes especially to regulatory measures in terms of restoring consumer confidence in those issues. And now we have 3 practitioners with us from the tourism sector to talk about the practicalities and the learning in terms of implementing human rights due diligence in the tourism sector. So I'm really pleased to have with me this morning or this evening for some of our participants here. We have Clare Jenkinson, Head of Sustainability from the UK Travel Association. We have Natalie Kidd, who is the Chief People and Purpose Officer from Intrepid Travel. And we have Willem Niemeijer, who is the founder and CEO of Yaana Ventures and the founder of Kiri Travel. All 3 of you certainly have experience implementing human rights due diligence within your own companies, or Claire, in your instance, coming from a business association level, you've seen a number of your members go through this, perhaps supported them in that, have a bit of that bird's eye view of their experiences as well. So before we dive in and learn about your experiences and practices implementing measures to respect human rights, I want to know first and have all of our audience today know who you are and briefly introduce yourselves and maybe, you know, for example, how long you've been working on this human rights and business thing. And I'll just ask you to introduce yourselves briefly so we can also make sure that your audio is working and we can hear you well. So Natalie, if you could please kick off for us, just introduce yourself and tell us a bit about, you know, when did you begin thinking about this human rights and business thing?
Wonderful, thanks, Julie. So for those that don't know Intrepid Travel, we're an Australian headquartered business, but we are truly global, where we were founded over 30 years ago, and we are now the largest adventure tour operator. We describe our product as sustainable experience-rich travel, and we're a vertically integrated business. So we have our own Intrepid teams in over 30 countries around the world, doing everything from that front-end sales to our source markets in UK, Europe, Australia, Pacific, North America, and other places. But we also have over 20 of our own destination management companies. So we're actually operating our own tours in the vast majority of destinations around the world. And we're also the world's largest travel B Corporation. Since 2018, we were certified there. And that means that we're legally committed to balancing purpose and profit and considering, you know, the needs and welfare of not only our customers, but our workers, our suppliers, and our communities and environment in all the decisions that we make. So I've been with the business, like a number of our senior leaders, for quite a long time. So it's just ticked over 16 years. The majority of that time I was in a more operational role, setting up our DMCs around the world. And last year I just moved from the role of Chief Operating Officer into my current role of Chief People Officer, Chief People and Purpose Officer. But we've really been, even ever since Intrepid was founded, we've had responsible travel as the ethos behind what we do. So I'd say I've been doing it the entire time I've been with Intrepid, even though it probably wasn't articulated as such 15 years ago, but it's been a long journey, and like most things in sustainability, there's always more to do. But we have been on the journey for a while.
Thank you, Natalie, for that. Certainly a lot of experience to share with us. I know this will be so valuable to our audience today. Willem, I want to toss to you. Take a minute, introduce yourself if you would. Yeah, same ask. Tell us when you started thinking about this human rights and business thing. What's the arc of your history?
Yeah, sure. First of all, great to be here in this team, and very topical thing to talk about these days. In particular, with the impending recovery after this COVID debacle happened in the world. So my name is Willem Niemeijer. I founded Kiri Travel back in 1993 in Thailand as a DMC for the then starting Indochina region. So that's Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, and based out of Thailand. So Kiri Travel is still there. We are in 7 destinations in Asia right now. And aside from that, we also do a lot of other sustainable, responsible travel businesses. And those we do as a partner within Yaana Ventures, of which I'm the CEO. And Yaana Ventures is a partner in a number of different sustainability travel and tourism ventures. So amongst those are eco-lodges in Thailand and Cambodia. We have travel tech and some other things and in the travel industry. And all of this we do with a keen eye on the triple bottom line. And that has been something that we've been doing from the very early beginnings of Kiri Travel since 1993. So as Natalie just mentioned, that was actually more before all of this, sustainability and all that became a word and became even a thing in the travel industry. And for us, that always has been a part of what we do, simply because we set up business in some of the then poorest countries in the world. So we felt a key need to be very aware of making human rights and fair business a very important keystone of all the business that we do. And that is still until today's day a thing that we do. So yeah, that's in short about me. I can go on for an hour, but let's not do that.
That's all good. Well, we will get there. So Willem, thank you so much for introducing you and your businesses, and again, a very long experience with this topic, actually, that I'm sure we'll all benefit from today. Clare, you've got, again, that bird's eye view. You sit at the association level, seeing what a lot of different companies do and how they interact between each other, perhaps trying to understand and address human rights issues as a sector. So share with us just a little about you and maybe, yeah, your origin story with business and human rights.
Yeah, of course. So yes, I'm Clare Jenkinson. I am Head of Sustainability at ABTA, the Travel Association. And as you say, our members are tour operators and travel agents. And all in all, I think we have about 90% of the outbound UK package tourism market within membership. So as Head of Sustainability at ABTA, I support our members to address sustainability, whether that's in their operations, in their supply chain, with their customers, or in destinations. And you know, sustainability in tourism, it covers lots of issues. We've broken it down into 4 areas, and obviously they interconnected and interlinked, but in terms of the practical actions that travel companies can take, it's quite helpful to break it down into these 4 areas. So the first area being environmental issues, climate change, waste, water, etc., measurement, targets, reduction. The second area being destination impacts and community impacts. We've got animal welfare, and importantly, we're looking at human rights as a fundamental sort of area of sustainability in travel and tourism. And we sort of, obviously there's overlap, you know, environmental issues are also human rights issues. We were sort of looking at human rights in that way because it's around how do you address human rights? It's the due diligence approaches. So that's why we've kind of looked at it like that. And we've looked, you know, at a range of human rights issues in tourism for a long time. ABTA has been working on child safeguarding for a very long time. Accessible tourism, making tourism accessible to everyone, regardless, for example, whether they have a disability or not. We've been, you know, leaders in that field, supporting members on that for a very long time. But I think one of the kind of game changers in this, I think, was the UK Modern Slavery Act. This came out in 2015. So for those of you that aren't aware, this is a law that requires companies of any sector with a turnover of over £36 million and who operate in the UK, they don't need to be based in the UK. They have to publish a statement on their website signed by their directors that sets out what the risks of modern slavery are in their business, what due diligence they're taking, are they training their staff, for example, and what's happened as a result of that. And I think that has been a real kind of catalyst to take those conversations about what is human rights due diligence, what do you do, into sort of boardrooms, and that's been a real change. And so we've been supporting our members on that journey with guidance. We've developed training for staff that our members can use to train their staff on modern slavery. And also, for example, we have a sustainable certification scheme for hotels called Travel Life for Hotels. And a lot of our members use that as a form of their due diligence. And I can talk more about some of the examples of that in a moment.
Okay, Claire, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Yeah, the association level, a lot of activities and support going on there to all of your members and the various work they're doing to undertake their due diligence. So, you know, something that struck me when you were doing your intros, I think both Natalie and Willem actually brought this up, especially because of your long history thinking about human well-being and dignity in the work that you do. I love that you brought up that you didn't necessarily give it this kind of maybe impressive sounding title of human rights due diligence, but the core of the concept has been in your thinking and activities for some time. And I think that's a valuable takeaway unto itself, to maybe take away some of the fear of, oh my gosh, now I need to embark on this seemingly overwhelming big structure thing. And so maybe, Natalie, if I can kick off with you, I want to ask you exactly, how did that journey for you at Intrepid Travel begin, of undertaking that knowing and showing how the business activities affect people, how you can try to make sure that that impact is as positive as possible, whether or not you called it human rights due diligence. Talk us through some of the first steps that now in hindsight, maybe you realize, yeah, those were the first steps for us, and maybe why you started there as well.
Sure. I think when we started, and of course, everything's developed, but from the very early days of Intrepid, the founders talked about responsible travel and what we now refer to as human rights, environmental protection, all these other things were elements of that. But we just had this one kind of catchphrase, which was responsible travel. Our business, though, is so reliant on local communities. And while we deliver the tours, a big part of what we're showing our customers is the real country and trying to make those connections for them. So it's heavily reliant on the local communities that we come into contact with on our tours. And so having a positive impact rather than a negative impact on them was absolutely critical. And so I think in those early days, we were talking about how you can educate your customers that we're showing respect, whether it's through dress or language or interactions, But that was kind of the early forms. I think one of the next things that was quite obvious as things developed, and I'm sure Willem has similar examples for us being initially heavily Southeast Asian based, we then kind of moved on to looking at that child protection piece. And as we were traveling through many of these countries, and back in 2005, I was based in Vietnam at the time, just looking at how we can make sure we're taking away the negative impacts of tourism, and child protection was part of that. But also another one that kind of steps us forward and closer towards modern slavery. Looking back, it's almost impossible to believe that a common thing that was done in Southeast Asia and other parts of the world is you would go to visit an orphanage. And then, you know, that kind of realization and the development of tourism going, actually, this isn't an activity that we should be doing. And in the Australian modern slavery legislation, we actually advocated quite heavily to make sure that orphanage tourism was captured as part of that. But a lot of these steps were just traveling around the regions, seeing things, having our staff and our tour leaders kind of report back and going, wait a minute, this isn't okay, or that isn't okay. And just developing step by step. I think what Lise, the first speaker, talked about, just gradual improvement over time is how it's developed. And I guess taken us from that initial concept of just responsible travel to, you know, now we're far better at articulating it and putting risk plans together and moving forward.
Thank you, Natalie. Yeah, what I'm picking up from that is, you know, there's an origin story around an ethos or a values system for the company that says, yeah, we want to do this in a way that respects human beings and the planet. It seems so basic, and yet, of course, business practices over, especially the last decades, have sometimes shown other practices. And holding on to that ethos or values in the multiple decade history of Intrepid travel is, I'm sure, has been interesting to observe with other pressures going on. And I also appreciate you drawing a connection to being observant at the beginning. You talked about becoming aware of child protection issues in Southeast Asia. And this is about, that's not a complicated management system. That's about opening your eyes. You said you were based in Vietnam. You were just like looking around you and observing these issues are going on and being aware of that. For some of our audience members, maybe who are feeling overwhelmed by the concept of, oh my gosh, now I have to do human rights due diligence. Again, maybe trying to lower some of that fear by saying, yeah, but we can all look around us and be aware of the contexts in which we are operating. So I appreciate those insights, Natalie. And Willem, I mean, I want to pose the question to you, which is, you've also started, you said 1993, and you said from the very beginning that, again, this ethos or these values of, you called it the triple bottom line, was important to you. Tell us sort of how you started actualizing those values, making those values real, the things you had to think about and be aware of to achieve the triple bottom line, and how that, of course, then translates into what we now call human rights respect and human rights due diligence.
Yeah, thank you. Quite interesting, because when we started, there was basically no tourism infrastructure. It's kind of a little bit difficult to imagine, but Cambodia was just coming out of its UNTAC elections, and there was really nothing, hardly a hotel to be seen, and the hotels that were there were occupied by the UNTAC forces. But they have, of course, sites to go to. Laos, much the same, and even Vietnam, much the same as well. So, and with infrastructure, I mean everything. So physical infrastructure, but also there was no labor infrastructure or anything. So when we organized our early trips and throughout the 90s and the early 2000s, we were 100%, we needed to have locals to help us operate the tours. So you immediately get to, well, kind of like, if your offer is good enough, you really need to treat the locals who are going to operate the tours or part of the tours for you with respect, otherwise they won't do it. So it's kind of a logical way of doing this and setting up the whole travel industry and the whole travel infrastructure. Being part of that in those early days was really, a logical way to move forward. So the triple bottom line, in particular when it comes to the support to communities and being profitable, these two things were really in the beginning very, very important. Environment at that time, not as much. There was still a lot of jungle, and also in that 30 years that have been cut down quite a bit. But yeah, so it kind of came in a logical succession of things. We didn't really think about it. We just did it because it was a logical way to operate, the only way to operate, actually. And then only later on, things became more standardized, and responsible travel became a word and a thing. And there were ways that you could do things better than other things. And then it was logical because we already did this. So we were basically, same as Intrepid, similar type of time. Intrepid at that time, as Natalie said, also heavily involved in Southeast Asia. So we kind of shaped the whole industry, if you will, in that sense, the adventure travel industry at the very least. And then only later on, when you got international players coming in, bigger hotels, hotel chains, and price pressure on the whole system, that is when it became really important to start to think about the framework and to start thinking about, okay, well, we can't go down in this price spiral because we have to upkeep certain kind of standards. And that's where we get into the formation and the more formalities of sustainability and the forming of GSTC and all of this that gave those frameworks were really, really helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Willem. That's I want to come back to that point you just came up at the end, which is sort of the evolving pressures and then how you can cope with that. But I want to come in here also to remind our audience, you can ask questions. You could put them in the Zoom chat. There's so much deep experience and knowledge between Natalie, Claire, and Willem. So please, they are willing and prepared to answer your questions, and we'll be glad to bring them into our conversation. So maybe as you're thinking up a question, I want to turn to Claire. In the meantime, Claire, you've got this terrific addition to our panel conversation because you're sitting up here seeing a lot of different practice. You already spoke to one key issue that I think you observed with your membership, which is for some of them, the human rights due diligence work really got galvanized or catalyzed through the Modern Slavery Act. So that was pointing to regulation, which really pushes things forward. But then for your membership overall, where would you say a lot of them maybe began the work of knowing and showing that they respect human rights? What was a point of departure, so to speak, that you saw maybe in common across the membership, or maybe a couple of different examples if there wasn't so much a single point of departure in the membership?
I'm going to go back to the Modern Slavery Act, actually, because I think that was, where it became sort of codified and consistent perhaps across some of our members. So things like identifying risk, I think that was happening organically within, naturally within a lot of our members. But when they had to write it in a statement, that was where they sort of went through that process of these are, looking at where they were operating, how they were operating. So I think, for example, that idea that actually if there's less oversight, that is an area of higher risk, for example. I don't think people were necessarily thinking in that way before, because if you had less oversight, you were less involved, you kind of looked at it less. But actually, I think the Modern Slavery Act and that process of risk assessment was quite helpful to go, actually, we maybe need to look at that a bit closer because we have less oversight. So I think that kind of that risk assessment, I think that was I think for many companies, the first time that it was kind of written down and thought through in a kind of structured way, perhaps. And then the other thing with the same was you kind of look at the policies and the actions that you take. Now, absolutely, for many companies, these policies were already in place. It was their supplier codes of conduct. It was their whistleblowing policies. It was their, the anti-discrimination policies that they had in place. And I think that was very clear that when companies looked at what they already had, much of this was already there, but it was about kind of seeing how it all fitted in and fitted together in this kind of minimizing risk of human rights. Mm-hmm. And then I think what's been quite new for companies in this process is that idea that finding something and taking action and remedying it, or trying to make it better, that is a good thing. I think, and particularly it was interesting seeing different parts of the business. I think from the legal part of the business, the kind of instinct was, we've looked, we have no problems, that's a good thing. I think that was perhaps where a lot of companies thought they should be going. Whereas that switch in way of thinking about it, saying, actually, if you said we've looked and we have no problems, you haven't looked properly. And actually it's finding things and taking action. That is how you define success. And I think that has been quite new for a lot of our companies as well.
Yeah, that's a really interesting insight, Claire. I have to resonate with that in my own experience in the last near on decade. Very true, a shift from no, nothing's wrong through to yes, we found things and we're addressing it, which is again, I think part of that evolving maturity in terms of understanding the truth of the challenges that occur in the countries that companies do business in. And acknowledging that openly and taking action to address that as compared to shoving it away. I mean, in terms of exactly that issue, acknowledging the challenges that you face in the countries you operate, you all have already been pretty open about saying, yeah, there have been significant challenges in the operating contexts where we do business. That's the nature of our business for that matter. And as Lise, I think, put a point on it brilliantly this morning, tourism is an industry where you can't just go to a safer country. You can't just pull out and say, yeah, we're just going to now operate in the country with the highest level of legal protection for workers' rights, so we never have to worry about it because it's mandated anyway. That's not doable in your sector. And so I'm sure you are constantly aware in your work of the risks that your company or your member companies face on the ground at destinations. And I'm just sort of curious, we talked about the past, the arc of your own evolution on this. I want to ask about the future. What are the key concerns that you have in mind when it comes to human rights impacts for your company, those risks that you have, those really endemic systemic challenges you face? What's top of mind for you of like, yeah, this is still an issue and we're going to have to figure out creative ways to address this because it continues to be a challenge. I'm going to toss that. I think I'll change up my order a bit and toss that over to Willem if you kick off.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm actually very optimistic. I don't see many challenges on this aspect to our business particularly, but I am somewhat concerned about the overall business and the overall tourism business in our region. It's our source markets are tour operators in the West, in the United States. So there, this whole thing about sustainable travel, human rights, all of this is already for a long time living. And then on top of that, we are an experiential a travel company, very high cultural values, environmental values, and that we match our business relationships so to that matter. So again, I'm not concerned about Kiri Travel or our lodges when it comes to that. But what I am concerned about is the pressure of new developing markets. Pre-pandemic, we saw, for example, Thailand getting 40% of its tourists out of China. And that is something that we don't have a handle on at all. But you can imagine the volume of 40% of that business and quite from one market makes it a very important part of the success of any of these type of implementations of laws. Because by itself as well, simply because of the volume of the market, we see that gets a big grip on the supply chains, and entire hotels going in that direction, or entire transport companies going into that direction, even airlines, moving in that direction simply because of the business volume. So I'm concerned about that, on how in our operating countries, and we operate in Southeast Asian countries, how that would actually work, and if our good intentions are not going to be snowed under, if you will, under the avalanche of other source markets that may even be the source of the recovery. Very hard to say right now, but it might well be. So yeah, I'm overall there's concerns about that, but not so much about our business or the members, for example, of ABTA. I think we work with a number of them, and we see that we are on one line. We are on one line in that it's kind of like easy to implement. But I'm more concerned about other newer source markets.
Yeah, and thanks, Willem, for illustrating that aspect, which is I think what I'm noticing is that you're immediately perceiving that human rights don't exist in a vacuum, and so larger contextual developments such as where are the guests coming from, what service providers are they using to get to these destinations, what are their values, approaches, and interests when it comes to their tourism experience. That plays a factor in how you do business with respect for human rights. We can't ignore these items. It's a very integrated view that you have to have from a company perspective. And I appreciate you illustrating that with this case. A couple of questions coming in further for you, Willem, actually in our chat. So I'm going to be integrating these as we continue our talk. But Natalie, I want to toss over to you to also ask you this question. What issues are big on your mind, human rights challenges that you foresee into the future in the work of Intrepid Travel?
I don't necessarily think it's an issue per se, but I just think there's always more to do. And to Claire's point, which is absolutely valid, if you're not finding anything, you're probably not looking hard enough, particularly when it comes to issues in the supply chain. So we've been on this journey for a long time, as we've discussed, but the future road doesn't get any shorter. I think there's always more to do. For us, evaluating where we're at, particularly, I guess, looking at modern slavery and the reports, and being a global business, we pick up a number of the different legislations around the world. We started working with an external consultancy in human rights just to assess where we were at. And of course, when we see things and pick them up, we'll put in rectifications, but what else can we do? So I guess we're always challenging ourselves in that way. And working with this external consultancy, they broke things down into looking at 4 levels, defining them from emerging, evolving, embedding, and excelling. And we're probably halfway along that journey, but we've still got a lot of things to really bed down. Things we might have done in the past on a more ad hoc basis now has to be consistent, standard, and done everywhere, not just, we'll start in areas that we believe are higher risk, but ultimately need to kind of roll that out globally around the world. So there's always more to do, and you know, human rights is one element of operating sustainably. There are of course lots of others as well, and it's how you keep each of those areas progressing. And I think as a business we'll just continue to keep challenging ourselves. Issues will change over time, but we want to just keep progressing and keep pushing it forward. So not an issue per se, but just we want to keep moving.
Thanks Natalie for that. I mean, the word that I'm thinking about, and maybe too much management consultant speak, but hopefully it makes sense, is it's a maturity curve. And I hear you talking about embedding. You know, embedding is the second step in the human rights due diligence process. All of you address this issue of structure, frameworks as part of that maturity journey in terms of respecting human rights in the business. It starts from a place of basic human common sense, looking around you, observing what's going on here, how do I understand my operating context, and moving through to really getting systems in place, really embedding it, making it always part of the practice to manage those risks. So thanks for illustrating that for us as part of the ongoing journey that you're on. Claire, tossing to you, you've got a broad membership that undoubtedly is very much bringing up all the time, okay, this is what we're thinking about in the future, that we're concerned about here or there, and added to that the uncertainty that the pandemic has brought. So what are the issues connected to human rights that you're hearing about from your members that they're thinking about going into the future?
Yeah, I think there's two kind of points there. I think, first of all, I think people are very aware in terms of restarting tourism, what has been happening in destinations for the past sort of 18 months, or, you know, in some cases a bit longer. You know, there has been a big variety in support from country to country in terms of, you know, whether people have had income support, or so, you know, it has been really tough for many people, and so when you're restarting business, the implications of that, I think people are very aware of that, and I think it's still very early days, but I think wherever you have kind of very high vulnerability, you have high levels of risk. But kind of more broadly, one of the areas that I kind of want to see more of, and I think we're going to see more of, is, you know, we've been talking a lot about risk assessment, looking at issues, identifying risks, and sort of putting in policies in place. But I think I expect to see more of, this is what we found and this is what we did. And there are going to be kind of easier examples. So I could share one easier example. Remember using Travel Life for accommodation, and the audits threw up that, or showed that one hotel was retaining staff passports. That is, you know, an indicator of forced labour, because staff can't freely leave their jobs. And Travel Life for accommodation was able to have the conversation with the hotel about why they wanted them to change the practice. The hotel changed the practice. It was a slightly systemic issue within the region, but it was sort of able to. So that's kind of a kind of small. Well, it's not, but relatively easy to take action to fix. I think a lot of issues are a bit more complicated and require a bit more collaboration. I think one of the concerns is always, you know, how do we make sure the action that we take doesn't make things worse for the individual, actually? Because, you know, I mean, I know it's about making things better, but sometimes you're worried about, you know, if we as an outsider raise a concern, you know, are people going to lose their jobs, etc. So I think that can be really complicated, and it's helpful to work with others and get advice on that. And one area of advice as well is sometimes issues that get thrown up, there's kind of different takes on it. So people may remember that Ben and Jerry's recently made headlines for divesting from the occupied territories and actually got a lot of criticism. Similar challenges for some of our travel companies, and actually it was advice from the Foreign Common and Development Office in terms of, well, actually in this particular setting, what are the issues, what is their advice to business, and that's been really helpful, and we can sort of help our members have that conversation with the Foreign Common Development Office, so UK government for people that aren't aware, with UK departments. So there are, I think that's an area of challenge is actually what action is right, and I expect to see more and more examples of that going forward. But it's a good thing, having these conversations about what actions companies need to take. It means that we're identifying the issues in the first place.
Claire, thank you for giving those two examples, and I love that you put a head on it. What action is the right one to take? Answering that question is not so easy, because this is about a business that's operating in a bigger operating context. Now, we have just about 5 minutes remaining, and I want to pull some of these threads together in a question that's also common from the audience that is largely, I think, targeted at Willem. And this sort of, for me, brings together a number of the threads in the conversation, which is doing business in high-risk contexts. What does that mean? Maybe that means that the legal framework that fundamentally protects workers' rights, communities' rights, is not really in place. Willem, you talked about a tourism infrastructure that was almost non-existent, which leaves a lot of space for exploitation if the tourism operator wants to go in that direction. And you also talked about in a post-conflict zone, which is very high risk. And that's where those vulnerabilities lie that Claire brought up. And so connected to this is a question from the audience, which is, okay, you're operating in this high risk context. There's a lot of risks there. You're trying to do this responsibly. Maybe that's even in your ethos, the founding reason for your existence. How do you extend that core value as a company to the people you hire and your value chain partners? Maybe you believe in it, but how do you spread that? Because at the end of the day, if you can't spread it, you won't achieve it. So that's our question from the audience, beginning certainly to Willem.
Okay, well, that's a very good one, and it's fundamental. So you make a higher purpose for your company, and from then on, everything comes down from that on, and then you create your vision and your mission and your values. And you won't succeed if your team is not on board with the values and your mission, and is not aware of a higher purpose. You simply will not succeed. It will not be successful either internally as an organization, or, and let's face it, in the tourism industry, we work for travelers. We work for tourists. Those are our clients, and that's where the rubber hits the road. So if you are not performing according your purpose and your vision, you will be found out. And in these days of social media, will found out right away. So there is no plan B. There is no alternative. You have to do things according to your vision and to your purpose, and your team needs to be on board with that as well. And they will be on board with it, and then they will find you.
I think we've got a little bit of a break from Willem.
To your core values.
Willem, we lost you just for a minute. If you can just pick up where you said that your team, if your team is on board, they'll also hold you to account when it comes to staying committed to those values.
That is correct. Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm on a hotel network, so yeah, exactly that. So it's very important for any company, and Intrepid would know this, is to make sure that your team is always in line with your values and with your purpose, because that way they will get to the results that we promise our clients, And because of that, they will internally be critical about your organization if you make a misstep or something like that. And, you know, much like Intrepid, we have committees in our businesses that look at those type of things that are independent of management. Earlier, Claire mentioned Travel Life for Hotels as a framework. We use that with our lodge in our eco lodge in Thailand. It's super helpful as a framework there. And then you will have a third party looking into your business as well and tapping you on the shoulder if something is not right. But I would say it a little bit differently. Basically tapping you on the shoulder. Hey, are you aware that you can do this or the other thing that we were not aware of because we are, you know, we are not in a Western country. We operate in Southeast Asia, so it's very helpful. There's also Travel Life for tour operators, of which we are a member as well with all our destinations. So all of this is very helpful in making sure that you're doing the right thing.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Willem. A lot of deep experience there and deep experience from all of you. We are out of time here, so I'm afraid that I need to close the panel now, but just to promise also to everybody in our audience today, you're going to have a lot more chance to have this kind of really rich exchange with practitioners and learn from very practical experience in the breakout sessions that happen after the upcoming break. So really, if you're learning a lot from your peers in these kinds of detail level discussions, stick around for that. I want to extend a very warm thank you to Natalie, Claire, and Willem for being with us, sharing with us your expertise, your knowledge, long and deep experience here. So big thanks to you all. We're going to go into our break and we're going to return from the break at 12:25 Germany time. And that is when we will kick off with our hands-on good practice sessions. 12:25 Germany time, we will resume. Huge thanks to our panel, and I'll see you after the break.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I think you are back from your breakout sessions, coming back in from those hopefully very enriching conversations with your peers and colleagues to learn from some really practical examples. So now we're back in the main meeting room and coming into the end stretch of our symposium and time together today. For those of you who haven't seen me before, maybe you just did the breakout sessions, I'm Julie Schindall. I've been the moderator for today's symposium. And the task now falls to me to try to give kind of a wrap up, a summary, a reflective point of all the conversations and exchanges that I've heard and participated in throughout our day, and perhaps a sense of where it goes from here. And after I share those reflections, we'll turn to Petra Thomas for a closing remark. So what can I say? All that we've heard today, you know, I've been sitting here, I poked my nose into all of the breakout sessions and heard a bit about these, all the cases and experiences that were shared. And then after I did that, I came back to my quiet moderator's table and I thought, gosh, what a range of topics we've talked about today. My sense is, I don't know about you, but my sense is that we started off the day talking about big picture issues and burning issues, ideas like human rights due diligence and the vision set out in the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. That's becoming mandatory, and we can say almost in a global sense, because even if only certain jurisdictions put those mandatory measures in place, because business operates in a total value chain approach, it affects business in many, many countries, and not just in the country that set out a given regulation. We dove into depth about what that means, what expectations are from companies to have a management system in place to prevent and address human rights risks or impacts if they've occurred, but understanding from our first speaker, Lise Smit, that smart legislation, if it adheres to the vision of the UN guiding principles, would not expect companies to go out there and alone solve all the human rights problems in the countries in which they operate. And then from that, I would say very sort of detailed and pressing conversation, we pulled back the lens. We talked about, again, to use a term that just resonates with me somehow, that long arc of history with Doug Lansky, who talked us through really understanding why companies need to do business with respect for fundamental human dignity and welfare, and some examples from regulations in particular that have helped with this. I don't know about you, that parking lot example really spoke to me. Yes, we still draw lines about where you're supposed to park the car in the lot, even though we arguably all know how to park the car. So trying to illustrate the value add of mandatory measures on company practices, such as it relates to doing business with respect for human rights. And then we had our terrific panel who came to us with just a lot of experience in doing this. And they shared with us just, I think, the tip of the iceberg in terms of their profound experiences, knowing and showing, observing their risks, being sensitive to context, and their maturity journey in terms of saying, okay, so we're aware of this. Maybe we've put in place some policies. We maybe had some ad hoc measures that, we kind of developed bespoke for a certain place or that, recognizing then that we need to actually standardize this a bit, make sure that we have an operating framework that makes sure that we are putting these risk management systems in place across our business and through our value chain. And in the words of Natalie Kidd from Intrepid Travel, the journey just keeps going. And then this afternoon, or my afternoon, I should say, we dove in and heard from all of our terrific speakers in these breakout sessions. And what I heard, I assume that not everybody was able to go into all of the different breakout rooms. So very briefly, I just want to take a moment and share with you some of the highlights that I was able to capture when I was able to poke my nose into those rooms and hear a bit about all of these very interesting examples and practices. We had a breakout room that focused on work in Indonesia to prepare for sustainable tourism with a particular focus on preserving cultural heritage. And for the time, at least that I was with you, I'm sure there were other relevant points that came up. What I took away was big learning around, and this is very much in the UN guiding principles, very anchored in leading practice, which is ensuring that you're hearing from the affected community, from people who would be affected by sustainable tourism, integrating their voices immediately. It seemed to me almost from the start of the work to ensure that their voices are heard and factor into planning and decision making. And also a focus on empowering local people to understand, okay, if tourism comes here, what are the potential implications of that? What can I do to protect and support my community? Because of course, tourism has huge pros and can have huge cons. So again, that focus on empowering the community to be a leader in their own tourism development were some takeaways I had from the little bit of time that I was able to join that breakout room. We heard about an interesting piece of work that sounded like it's still a work in progress around social labeling, almost like a certification system for hotels and restaurants, and particularly an experience coming out of Spain. I think that the takeaway from that, where there were some interesting questions that I at least observed around being aware of the larger landscape of attempts to assess how human rights are respected in business, and then maybe give a label to it or a certification to it, and a necessity of understanding how that assessment plays a role in bigger certifications or bigger labels. And I was particularly interested, and of course, nobody knows the answer yet. I think Carlos spoke to what will the Spanish government's role be here? And I think that in doing human rights due diligence by companies, those of you who know the guiding principles, it's not just about what companies do. The entire first portion of the UN guiding principles talks directly at governments, and governments have a critical role to play when it comes to their duty to protect human rights. And I thought it was interesting, Carlos brought in that point. We're waiting to see what the government is going to do in terms of their role in this potential attempt to demonstrate and really check if hotels and restaurants are adhering to fundamental rights. So that was, for me, a little takeaway in the bit of that session that I was able to see. We had the breakout room on conducting political tours in authoritarian regimes. This one to me was fascinating. I've also been to some of those places, so I was really interested to see what came out of that panel. And there I found a connection to something that I've noticed throughout our conversations today, which is about recognizing also the responsibility of the tourist and empowering them almost in that. And of course, there's been discussions around, well, if consumers only called for it, business would do better, but consumers just want the cheapest thing, so why bother? That's certainly a line of argument that we've heard before. But I found in the presentation that we heard in this breakout room that there was a real focus on ensuring that travelers, tourists themselves were very prepared for their visits, very sensitive to the contexts in which they were traveling. And overall, going back to that point that we discussed a bit with Willem, Natalie, and Claire this morning around being aware of the context in which you are operating, I would say the guiding principles approach or the Ruggie approach is always first and foremost about being aware of your risks, not closing your eyes to them and not denying that they exist. It's more about recognizing them and managing them effectively. And then finally, we had a breakout room about supporting informal workers in the context of COVID-19. And there was a case study out of Thailand. And for me, this was one of the, Graham from the Pacific Asia Travel Association put this into words, which I just thought was so valuable. He noted that the experiences that people take home with them after a trip so often are interactions with informal workers. He was citing people working at a market or a local tour guide, and the necessity of ensuring that their voices are valued, heard, and play a role in decisions that affect their fundamental dignity and welfare. And again, bringing it back to that point around the importance of connecting and valuing what we call in the guiding principles, the stakeholder perspective, the perspective of affected people. So I know I wasn't able to be in all of the breakout rooms with you. I'm sure your conversations were even richer than that. But just to give a brief overview, and maybe then, which gives a sense of the vastness of the conversations that I think we've had today. We should not underestimate that. If you're feeling at this moment, if you've been with us all day, maybe you're feeling at this moment a little overwhelmed. Maybe you're feeling a little like, okay, we touched on a lot of stuff. I don't know about where my company is, or I feel like this is completely overwhelming. We'll never get this right. And now these expectations are going to be mandatory. Oh my goodness, how are we going to cope with that? And I think that's an absolutely legitimate concern and feeling. I've been working in human rights for a while and I still have that feeling. And yet I think that what we heard from our speakers today throughout, whether in the breakout rooms or in the main sessions, was step by step. And I think that as much as it maybe sounds easy, it's actually the reality. It's certainly what I've observed in years working with business on implementing the guiding principles, step by step. And I just want to draw attention to maybe, for me, what was one of the biggest takeaways of the day, which was it begins with values. It begins with an ethos. We heard that from our panel of colleagues this morning. And it begins with people. And what I've noticed is that the tourism sector starts and ends with people. The start of the value chain is that it's local communities and workers who deliver the services at the destination point. And at the end, it's the tourist. All along the way, for this industry to function, it's got to be a focus on people. And as Willem said, it just makes sense. You got to value these people. So I want to say the reason to do it is there. I think it's feasible step by step and through support initiatives like the Roundtable. There are lots of resources out there. It is possible. And I think the time is now. The temperature is turning up, as we heard right at the top of the day in our conversation with Lise. It is starting to become required. Value chain partners are expecting this, and it brings value to the business and to the sector, making it stronger in the long term. So as a reminder, you're seeing in your chat here that you can get the latest updates on the space of human rights and tourism from the Roundtable anytime. There's a link in the chat. And a reminder, before we have our closing notes from Petra Thomas, there will be a survey. We want to know if you liked the event. So when you leave the Zoom session today, you're going to get prompted with a pop-up to complete an anonymous short survey to tell us what you thought of the event. And we appreciate you doing that. So I'm out of time, and I'm very pleased to have some closing remarks from Petra Thomas, the Managing Director of Forum Anders Reisen e.V., a longtime Roundtable supporter and participant. So Petra, take it away, close us out for the day.
Thank you very much, Julian. Thank you very much, especially for your good accompanying us through the day and for the perfect summary you gave. It's an honor to have the last word, but to be honest, you said mainly everything what needed to be said for today's work. But I try to give you just a last remark on thinking about human rights and tourism, and I hope I don't sound too moralizing, because it's such a big issue, and I don't want to end with the moralizing thing. But when we have talked today about due diligence in supply chain, it is for one thing above all, due diligence in dealing with all the people who work in tourism and who are affected by tourism. This care is, or should be, deeply embedded in the core of an economic sector that depends on the interaction of so many people. It is about all of us, all the people who are working in tourism, our employees, our colleagues, our partners, whether in our own countries or all over the world where we organize travel. The current crisis in particular has shown us the extent of many people's dependency on tourism and its dramatic effects. The crisis has shown us our weak points. It is a chance to learn where the problems are exactly and to develop further and make changes. And we heard about a lot of interesting examples today, how to tackle these issues. It is our responsibility to ensure that traveling is not at the expense of the people in the countries where we are guests for a short time. Creating binding rules for this serves on the one hand to ensure that all companies in the market implement them in a standardized way so that not just a few pay attention. On the other hand, it clarifies what constitutes good supply chain management. In other words, it provides guidance on what needs to be done. Regulation avoids distortion of competition to the disadvantage of committed companies and actors like you all who joined today. Even if at first glance, the implementation looks like a mammoth task for many companies, especially for small ones, it can be solved in a deeply human way by jointly developing individual steps and measures, making them manageable, and thus defining many pragmatic and solvable options for action from a large task. Because what would happen if we do not take care? People will turn away from tourism. A bad employer who does not create fair conditions will not inspire any in the future. As a result, the quality of the tour suffer, which falls back on the companies. The acceptance of tourism will decrease. This option must not exist. The conference is one building brick in this chain of solutions that shows us the way. If we want to give people a positive perspective in and through tourism, we have to uphold human rights in our own interest. This is why it is so important that we join forces and discuss and tackle the challenges together. The Roundtable Human Rights in Tourism provides the platform for this. Together with its members, handouts, tools, and information are compiled that support small and medium-sized enterprises, in particular in implementing human rights due diligence. So I would like to encourage you all, and I'm sure you will, let's take it on together. Thank you all for participating and thank you for your interest.